All right, Professor Beniam, thank you so much for making the time. I want to really look at this from your sociology background. You're a professor of sociology at the State University of New York. And from that standpoint, how do you see the trajectory of the peace deal and people's reaction to it?
It's nice to be with you again, Hermela. Thank you. Well, it was, I think, a remarkable sort of set of circumstances when the peace agreement was signed after a very brutal and bloody 2-year war. In fact, it's the most consequential, brutal global war, much more brutal in its impact in terms of lives lost, over 1 million, and the damage that it's done with respect to infrastructure and economy, much more significant than, for instance, the much talked about, I think, in terms of media, the Ukraine. So the way it was received was with an incredible level, broadly speaking, of joy, if you will, right, of relief. And so there was a significant yearning for peace, and it actually reinforced the general sentiment that existed across the board. So despite the notion that Ethiopians are highly polarized along ethnic lines, class lines, or particularly ethnic lines, and the way in which the war itself was seen in a very ethnic lens, across the board, there was unanimous joy over the peace agreement. So that's first and foremost. Secondarily, there was also cautious, if you will, optimism, meaning that we'd have to see how the peace agreement actually is working on the ground. So the peace agreement itself has a very interesting genesis. So if you remember, the war itself, which started in November 3, 2020, and which ended through the peace signing agreement, cessation of hostilities in Pretoria, South Africa, 2 years later, essentially November 3, November 4, 2022. There was 3 rounds of war in between that period, that 2-year period. In that period, there was a reluctance to negotiate. There was a reluctance to cease hostility, particularly on the side of the TPLF and its foreign backers. And so the coming to the peace agreement in Pretoria was not necessarily a willing act, but it was no choice, particularly for the TPLF. So that's the context in which we have to understand how this peace agreement was arrived at. So I think the trajectory is very interesting because the areas of concern in terms of the peace agreement itself had to do with the nature of the TPLF and whether it was going to follow through with the peace agreement, and if the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia's government as well was going to follow through with their commitment. So those are the things that was raising in terms of a cautious optimism. The key, I would say, points to take was, or if we go back to think about the main reasons for why this conflict erupted to begin with, one had to do with the attempt at an insurgency to institute a regime change, and second, to negate the Constitution, of course, right? So the agreement, according to the Ethiopian government, achieved the objectives of the Ethiopian government. One was a monopoly of violence. That means within one country, there can only be one army. And so the idea for the peace agreement was that the TPLF would be demilitarized. There'd be a process of reintegration of fighters into normal life. And so there's a demilitarization process that was there. Second was the recognition of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ethiopia. And that was also agreed upon in that peace agreement. And the third element was a reintegration of Tigray into the federal structure of Ethiopia. So it would be having a transitional government, and then once elections would start, then that transitional government would be a legal government. Because prior to that, the TPLF had illegally established, unconstitutionally, its own election and claimed that it was its own government. So this is the process that you can see in terms of the trajectory of the peace agreement. And people were very, very concerned that there would not be a tangible, on the ground, verified demilitarization that was occurring in the TPLF.
The issue, Professor Beniam, about disarmament and demobilizing, it seems to be a very gray area. In the beginning, when the peace deal was signed, it was written into that agreement that the TPLF forces will be fully disarmed within 30 days, which sounded incredibly ambitious considering the scenario. And now 5 months later, Ambassador Redwan Hussein confirmed in the parliament hearing last week that full disarmament was never realistic, that they actually included it in that agreement to establish that they, the federal government, had won, but in reality, the way that they are doing it incorporates the people of Tigray into the security process, at least in the local and patrolling crime on a local level. So when you look at the way that's played out, is it expected? Was it dangerous to put in an expectation into the agreement that the Ethiopian people would expect that there would be fully disarmed TPLF forces when in fact there isn't? And what does that do for the peace process?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's intertwined with the larger instability in Ethiopia. The idea that each province or region should have its own military force was actually a product of the prior EPRDF. It started as a counterinsurgency force that was developed in the Somali region. And if we recall during that time, this counterinsurgency force, which was a special or Liu police or a Liu force or special force that was established, was charged by organizations such as Amnesty International and other human rights organizations as engaging in a significant amount of human rights violations. That was in Somali region of Ethiopia. So what started as a unique sort of project by the then EPRDF government has now been universalized. And so each region in Ethiopia, depending on its inclination, depending on the resources, has developed its own military infrastructure. And so the TPLF was the most robust in terms of military infrastructure. And one of the peace agreement's value was the idea that, again, only a central state can have a monopoly of violence. And so this was supposed to be a lesson, a jumping off point, so that you can have a demilitarization of other militias in other regions as well. Because the challenge of the central government and the sovereignty of the federal government from Tigray can also come tomorrow from another region, right? So the formula is still there. So what we were watching was, one, that this process of demilitarization happens. And the reason why that's important, by the way, is, remember, the war itself involved a attack that was, framed obviously as treason, but attack on the military, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, a very brutal attack that killed over 5,000 soldiers. But in addition to that, in the process of this war, significant amount of human rights violations that were happening in both Tigray, but outside of the region as well, in Amara and Afar. So all these regions, aside from Tigray, but all these neighboring regions are expecting demilitarization to ensure their safety concerns are met as well. So these are all interlocked, and the importance of that demilitarization process. So demilitarization also does not mean somehow denying the ability for the province and the people of Tigray to be able to have security infrastructure. But these security infrastructure can be like any security infrastructure in other federal arrangements, just like in the United States. You would have police, you would have intelligence, etc., that would be trained accordingly. But they are not military forces that can actually threaten the peace of both the central government, but also regions close by, neighboring states, etc. So that's why I think it was very important to seriously engage with this process of demilitarization. The ambassador's suggestion that this was a process of framing the peace agreement as a victory for Ethiopia, for the federal forces and the federal government is fine, because I think both parties, as soon as the peace agreement was signed, were trying to frame it in the best possible light from their particular perspective. But the federal government has a responsibility to ensure this process actually continues, simply because it is a structural issue. So this structure, even if we leave it aside for the sake of peace as an example, and it's pushed aside for 5 years, it actually emboldens, and legally speaking, it should allow all other states to also be able to beef up the security infrastructure and build their own armies, which we actually are seeing right now. So the dangers both to the federal structure of the state, the sovereignty of the state, and to law and order are very, very clear to see. And I think that's why the demobilization process has to be at the center. It has to be recognized. And it's also very important because without this process of demobilization, the very important things that are necessary to heal the wounds, to actually engage in the administration of justice and reconstruction cannot really move forward because of the fact that you have a constant security threat and sense of possibility of instability occurring for the surrounding peoples and regions as well. Well, there's a process of obviously reintegration, right? So Ethiopia's had this experience before. In fact, what's interesting is the TPLF engaged in a process of demobilization and reintegration, both of Ethiopian National Defense Forces, that is in the transition period in 1991 and on, but also of the Oromo Liberation Front as well, right? That those that were not, so we've had an experience both working with international actors to support a process of demobilization and reintegration of fighters into normal life. And so what we see though is not a very robust sort of activity that's happening along that route today. We don't see that at all, right?
Yeah, I
So
think your point about structure is really important in that it's less about whether they're all fully disarmed and more about the structure in which that people are allowed to be armed just for their own personal protection or for local policing level. And that is something that's not very transparent, which is why I think some people are really concerned. They can easily process whether the TPLF forces have been fully disarmed or not. But when it comes to, okay, some of them are allowed to have arms, but what does that look like? And how do we know that the TPLF forces will not be able to start a fourth round of war? I think that's the question that the government's not really able to answer or really show the people how that could be the case if that is the case.
absolutely. I mean, it's really, I would look at it as an opportunity, and it should not be a missed opportunity. So the first and foremost thing that the federal government has to do, obviously, is try to win the hearts and mind of the people of Tigray. So we've talked before, Harmela, when we said there's a distinction between the TPLF and the people of Tigray. And so that level of engagement, whether it's through communication and media and various sort of outreach, if you will, I don't see that happening at all, right? So that means there's a way in which the people of Tigray has to feel comfortable, right, and reassured that the process of reintegration into the federal structure is not going to be to their detriment. This war has been extremely traumatic, extremely traumatic. And in fact, people have not had an opportunity to breathe and really kind of reflect through this process of pain. So that's a very important aspect of this process. It's not simply these legal acts that are occurring, that are verified, and then that are reported, but it's also these very important political acts that have social outreach components to the population that are very important. Another element that should not be missed at all, right, is the fact that the reform government, so this government that exists in Ethiopia today, is standing on a platform of reform. And one of the key reform that it is attempting or promised in terms of its platform was to restructure or to at least open up in a dialogue to restructure the Ethiopian state from an ethnic based structure. And the reason why that's important is because the militias, special forces, and the armies that are built in each ethnic homeland are always in contestation based upon boundaries, contested land, etc. And so what we see, even in this period in which you've had the nation's eye and the world's eye on this war between the central government and the TPLF, is you've had militias from different regions actually attacking each other. Different regions of Ethiopia have been attacking each other over land, over territory, over resources. And so the issue then of demobilization is an opportunity to tie it to the general structural instability that ethnic federalism and claims making, both for political power and resources, by using force, right? That's what we see today, is the use of force to claim resources, to claim power.
The other thing I want to ask you is based on the Ministry of Justice's announcement that they were going to withdraw, or they have rather withdrawn, criminal charges against the TPLF, both civil and military leaders, and that they were going to have those cases dealt with in the Transitional Justice framework. What does that mean moving forward?
It's a remarkable turn of events. Remarkable turn of events. The law and order campaign, as it was framed by the federal government, involved one of the key aspects was apprehending individuals that engaged in a criminal act against the state, against members of the National Defense Forces, particularly, and treason as well. The Attorney General at that time had opened cases and was developing cases for prosecution against the defendants. And they were treated as defendants. They were not executed. These are high-level, both military and political TPLF operatives. So in this process of the trajectory of the peace agreement, one of the things that we see is a very problematic process, right? It's becoming politicized, meaning that we don't have a demobilization in significant fashion of TPLF forces. We don't have a inclusive interim regional administration in Tigray. In fact, one of the things that was extremely problematic, really, to see was the fact that the TPLF was given a carte blanche to constitute itself, right, to form a regional administration and exclude all other parties and actors within Tigray. And so it now is legitimized, even as an interim administration, to become empowered and monopolize power within Tigray, right? So it's resuscitated itself. The president, Getachew Reda, being nominated and of course legitimized again, was very, very problematic to see. Secondarily, it's not so much about individuals as opposed to organizations. And so the TPLF is an organization that has a political platform. One, it's committed to ethnic federalism, which I've already presented as a very problematic 30-year experience with significant implications for the stability of Ethiopia. Second, it's an organization also that's dedicated towards raising two issues as part of this ethnic federal way of thinking, and that is grabbing land and territory from neighboring regions. The first thing that the Getachew Reda did in terms of as a new president of this interim body was to indicate that they wanted these territories back from neighboring regions, which implies, again, that this is going to be a much more confrontational, no difference whatsoever, no new ideas. So what I'm trying to indicate here is that the ideas that are necessary, new ways of doing politics, the way in which that the entire northern peoples of millions of people have to find a way of living together. So this political organization not only doesn't have any ideas, but has an agenda that is anti-peace, anti-stability, and it's based upon, by the way, an incredibly almost ethno-racist perspective of neighboring peoples as well. So that's what is coming back legitimized as sitting on top of the power of Tigray. And it doesn't even raise this issue, which is that you can forget about democracy in Tigray, right? Even Dims Oyane, which is a radio station, TV station that is associated in Tigray, journalists, several journalists actually quit because they were unable to express different ideas that was not sanctioned by the TPLF. This is their playbook. So we shouldn't expect an organization that has not learned for over 40 plus years to somehow magically change overnight. So that's, I think, what's very worrying. So aside from that, this question of justice, I think, is very, very important. I know some of us, and you've read about it, you've heard about it as well in terms of people's reaction. Yes, in Ethiopia, unfortunately, people that are journalists and others that do good work actually will be taken to court, will be put in jail. You have criminals that involved in the death of hundreds of thousands of young people in Tigray, in Amara, in Wallo, etc. And they are relaxing on our TV screens, on social media, smiling and untouchable. That is a remarkable injustice, because it simply shows impunity. Those involved in high crimes and gross human rights violations are not being held accountable. The idea of this justice, even the peace agreement, which says that individual agency in terms of criminal acts would still be considered, is very important. But from the trajectory of the peace agreement, I'm extremely not convinced that actually both the government and, of course, the TPLF are going to actually hold an open process that would involve criminal proceedings and investigations in terms of their actions and the various parties' actions in the war, and hold those that violated the rules of war, that violate human rights violations, hold them accountable. So it's very important to understand context. So in the context of war, it's very logical not to use criminal justice approach in which, for instance, victims and perpetrators are identified, and those that are perpetrators will be held accountable for their actions. And the primary reason why is because the objective is a negotiated settlement that can arrive at some sort of peace, right? So always stopping conflict and war and killing is the priority. And when you have a criminal justice approach that goes after the perpetrators, in many cases, which are going to be leaders of militias, etc., you actually prolong the killing and the destruction. And we see that across Africa in terms of various types of civil wars. But the context in the Ethiopian northern Ethiopian war is very different, simply because the government actually forces had an upper hand, right? The government forces had an upper hand. So the fact that they opted for a non-criminal justice approach itself is very interesting, but not necessarily traumatic. But the non-criminal justice approach that looks at justice from a very broad perspective includes, for instance, criminal, social, political. And so in approaching it from that perspective, it tries to address several components, one of which, for instance, is to hold perpetrators accountable. The other, it becomes, particularly in conflicts that involve communities and in conflicts in which at one point one group could be victims and then they also become perpetrators, then the criminal justice approach is not enough. Secondarily, you also have to recognize that a key objective is actually the ability for communities to live together, because they're not going anywhere else, right? And this is the case in South Africa. This is the case in Rwanda. And so this is also the case in terms of objectively in Ethiopia. How can you build trust, have social healing that has been really eviscerated in the northern region, and reconciliation? And so an approach to justice that's not only fixated on criminal prosecution is actually to be applauded. But this does not give any signatories to the agreement the license to actually push aside criminal prosecution. So this does not mean that those that engaged in criminal violations, including the central members of the TPLF, are absolved of criminal investigation. So, of course, let them have their day in court. let the evidence be presented in a fair and balanced fashion where they have their defense attorneys, but let them have their day in court and let them face the court. And if they're innocent, they're innocent. If they're guilty, they should be held accountable. From the perspective of communities, what's very important is that both you have criminal prosecution, but you can also have various other aspects such as truth commissions. You can have questions of reparations, which is very important as well, in terms of the destruction that happened to your average sort of citizen and person all over northern Ethiopia. So you can have memorials, you can have ways of reconciliation between elders and community members that tries to heal the rift. All these can be done simultaneously. And I think they can reinforce each other so that people in any specific community are not going to feel that they're targeted if criminal prosecution is, for instance, brought against members of Amara militia or members of the federal forces or members of the TPLF, right? So you have to do these things simultaneously. It has to be seen as legitimate, not punitive. And that is the way you can begin the process towards a sort of an enduring peace. If this doesn't happen, then we're putting simply a small band-aid on a festering wound, right? It's really a misservice. So I think there's promise, but that promise actually has to be actualized.